A reading from Genesis 1:27 through 28. God created humanity in God's own image. In the divine image God created them, male and female God created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and master it. Take charge of the fish of the sea, the birds in the sky, and everything crawling on the ground." The word of God for the people of God.
Praise be to God. Thank you, Cece. For starters, this sermon is not finished. I could easily preach 3 hours on it, and I had a feeling that eventually you would like to go to lunch, or at least take a bathroom break. So I cut it, and this whole sermon series really is full of thick sermons, and so I recognize that in the 15 to 20 minutes I usually take, there is no way to answer all of your questions. If I took an hour, there would be no way to answer your questions, and scientists have proven we have an attention span of 17 minutes. So really, if I took an hour, you would only listen in 17-minute bits. I'm the same way. I get it. No problem. Please understand that I realize that I will bring up things that rattle your cage a little bit or challenge assumptions that you've always had. That is my way of being your pastor and forcing you to think about the assumptions that you have in your faith that you don't even realize that you have. It's also my way of feeding you not just religious platitudes, but also challenging you to honor your faith by thinking through your doubts and working through the things that challenge us. Also, I'll be publishing this manuscript on my blog after worship today. I invite you to explore this issue further. You can go to my blog by downloading the St. Paul's app on your smartphone, or if you don't have a smartphone, we'll be happy to print one for you in the office. Just give us a call during the week. Like I said, there's much more to say than I know that I have time to say, and I invite you to read and pray and study further. This sermon, like I said, isn't finished. It's an invitation to a conversation, which I'll be glad to have. If you'd like to make an appointment with me to talk about it a little more, feel free. This is about God and suffering. And suffering, when we talk about it, touches very deep nerves. And so I realize I am handling a very sensitive topic today. And please know that I am aware of that and will not say anything to purposefully poke unless there is a good answer at the other end of that poking. And I'll also be hugging you while I poke. Also, I'm not sure how long this sermon will be today. Like I said, tried to cut it, but if you need to leave early, you're free to. Also, if you're a neighbor of someone that decides to leave early, smile, say, "We're glad that you came." Don't judge them. And you can watch the sermon later online on our website at spocala.org. Also, if you just like to digest it again and watch it again, make sure you heard me right, you can. And I do invite you to stay and hear this conversation as we enter into some difficult subjects today and throughout the next week. All that being said, let's pray. Lord, as we gather here to worship you and build our faith, Lord, we know that sometimes building requires digging. And sometimes when we dig, we find things that we didn't even realize were there, that jump out at us and surprise us. Lord, as we reach into God in suffering and seek your word to us during this time, Lord, help my heart and my mouth be yours. Help our spirits be together as one, and help us look to you and pray to you and hear your word to us during this time together. Amen. This week, I spent most of it in Alabama at my wife's grandfather's funeral. It was her mother's father. And we spent, on Tuesday, we had his graveside service at a beautiful cemetery in Pine Hill, Alabama. If you don't know where Pine Hill, Alabama is, you're not alone. It is in Wilcox County. If you don't know where Wilcox County is, you're not alone either. There are no interstates running through Wilcox County. There really aren't even any four-lane roads running through Wilcox County. You might get a turn lane every once in a while or a blinking light. But it is, as my dad said, It's truly the boondocks of Alabama. If you think Alabama is boondocks, you should go to Wilcox County, and you will find out. It is. If you've ever seen the movie "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," those places really exist still, and they exist down there in Wilcox County, among some other counties down there, and in Georgia too, Mississippi. Welcome to the South. And Gramps, I'll call him Gramps, because everybody else does. Most people found out at his funeral that his real name was Johnny Floyd. Gramps grew up in Pine Hill, Alabama, in a little community called Enon. Enon is a suburb of Pine Hill. Pine Hill probably has about 1,000 people, and Enon is a suburb of that. To get to the cemetery in Enon, which we went to, and I have a little picture of the sign, it is a gorgeous place in the middle of the woods. You turn off of the main road in Pine Hill, which does not have any painted lines on it. You turn off of the main road in Pine Hill, you see the sign for Enon Cemetery, and you drive down a narrower semi-paved road, down a hill and up another one to a less paved road, which eventually does turn into dirt and goes over a huge gully, and all there is a pile of dirt. There's no guardrails, so you just look forward. And then the road gets further and further dirt, and then all of a sudden, after going down this dirt pig trail, you reach this parking lot. Beautiful, manicured, paved parking lot, and it is an old rural community cemetery out in Pine Hill, a gorgeous place. And most of Heather's mother's, Gramps' family, most of them are buried in this place. They've been there generations, and a lot of them still live in that area. And this cemetery is probably 5 acres of fenced in, and only half of it, not even half of it, is full. But it's just really, it was a gorgeous place. And my college major was anthropology, so archaeology is my thing. I love history. I love the stories of generations and the looking at different things and seeing what's there. And graveyards, just, as you know, I grew up catty-corner to one as a kid. Graveyards to me are magnificent places that tell a story. And at this cemetery, at an appropriate time, I didn't do it when it would be me being a jerk. I said a pastoral prayer to open the service and was not the officiant at the funeral, so I had some free time. And I took pictures of a lot of tombstones, partly because I was interested in Heather's family history, and this was an interesting opportunity to really take some pictures myself. But I began taking pictures of these cemeteries, or these gravestones, and I'm going to see if I can plug through them here. Does it work? We knew we were taking a chance, so. Okay, we'll walk through it together, Ashley. The first gravestone we saw, and you can't see the inscription and the date on it, so I will read you, but I took a picture of a lot of tombstones, and I began to realize the story that these tombstones told. This is way out in the country. There is no hospital anywhere around. Even now, if you get bit by a rattlesnake, you just say your prayers. There is really no hospital within an hour of this place. And this gravestone is infant son of T.D. and Ellie Mae Averett, October 16th, 1931. All right. If we go to the next one, we see infant, and you can't see because of the shadow. It was a real bright, sunny day. Infant of Joe and Mary E. Averett. This was Heather's, I think, 2 or 3 times great-grandparents. Right next to it, there was another headstone. Infant son of Joe and Mary E. Averett. Next to that, infant of Joe and Mary Averett. This, this was right here, this was along a little border of a couple of other gravestones that were kind of raised. Henry Clay Averett was born October 4th, 1906, and died September 12th, 1912, 6 years old. And this is, of course, back before these people did not have, these babies were born at home. And if the doctor got around to seeing them, that was great. But if not, then, you never know what was going to happen. And so there was a lot of sorrow here. And then finally, this last one was, those are little figurines on top of this bright blue. This is in the middle of a traditional cemetery. And this bright blue stone is there. And on top of it, it says George. It's George Averett. And this was also a child that was about 6 years old, 5 or 6. And there are still little stones. And my little niece was there, who's Ellie Mae, also. They didn't realize that there actually was another Ellie Mae in the family until they saw the tombstone this week. Elliot, though, we call her Elliot, she was playing around, and there were she was playing with another kid that was probably 4, a distant cousin, and they were playing with these little figurines, and the older cousin kept saying, oh, no, put that down, Elliot, this is for that little boy. And, Elliot she's 14 months old, she didn't understand, but just to make sure she didn't put them in her mouth, she was putting them back down, but there are still little child figurines around. And one thing that struck me as I was looking at these tombstones was just the sheer number of babies and infants. And there was a lot of pain and suffering in these tombstones. But another thing that struck me was that these were poor folks. If you know anything about the South after Reconstruction, we were poor folks. And then you go back further into the South where money really never got. These people didn't even know the Great Depression was going on when it went on because they'd been that way for a while. And yet, these are good granite tombstones. And this is a lot of expense for a family who didn't have it to memorialize their infant that passed away, their child that passed away. They went to the expense of getting a blue tombstone marker. And if any of you have ever dealt with funeral expenses, you know just how expensive they are. And you also noticed, you haven't seen Heather's mother's maiden name. Averett, though, is spelled different. These people were also illiterate. The real family name is spelled A-V-E-R-I-T-T, and they just spelled it A-V-R-I-T. Sometimes it was E-V-R-I-T in the cemetery. They just said whatever they thought it was spelled. And on these expensive tombstones, it just struck me at the pain and the suffering, but also the care that they took to make sure that a little child who'd probably only been in their life, not even a year, was remembered right there. And of course, losing children was much more common back then, but I imagine that it still broke people's hearts too. Children's suffering is one of those things that it rips us apart. We think of the innocence of childhood and the wonderful things that should happen to children. And when they don't, our hearts rightly are broken. And so these tombstones, though, just spoke to me about, in a way, how beautiful they tried to make this moment of sorrow and sadness. Part of what I'll go through today, and I believe in citing my sources. A lot of this sermon is taken from a book called Faith of the Christian Church by Tyron Inbody. It is a book that has revolutionized my faith, and it is a seminary textbook. But before you groan at it, it's actually a powerful book, and it's written in language that is not, master's level, esoteric, intellectual seminary. It actually is a pretty approachable book. There's even a glossary in the back. And it is a book that really I would commend to you for things like this, especially this section on God and suffering and evil. He writes a beautiful, wonderfully thought out passage on it. And a lot of what my sermon is on, I have taken from these chapters in the book. So I would recommend Faith of the Christian Church to you. It's a wonderful resource. And it goes through all of the classical kind of Christian doctrines, and he examines them and talks about them. But this particular section is just beautiful. It's all wonderful. But this book really hits it right on the head. And he writes, this is what he writes. He says, "No human experience challenges our faith in a sovereign and benevolent God more deeply than the suffering caused by the violence of individuals, communities, and nature. Although most of us have a strong sense of the goodness and well-being of our lives, our experience of pain, suffering, conflict, war, disease, plague, famine, hardship, hatred, cruelty, terror, destruction, and utter madness are just as real." Does that sound like a seminary textbook? That's why I love this guy. "The 20th century was so dominated by wars that it has been called the century of violence. The genocide of the Holocaust is a primary symbol of that century. This conceptual problem in theology is called theodicy. Theodicy is taken from two words. Theos in Greek is the word for God. So it is God, just like theology is the study or the examination of God. Theodicy has dike at the end, and dike is a Greek word that means justice or righteousness. It's where we get our word for deacon, someone who is righteous and works in justice and seeks to connect God's justice to the world. That's a deacon. And dike is a word that means that. And so theodicy is the study of God's justice in the midst of a world that is not just. And so technically the theodicy question, the central problem of theodicy is this. If God is omnipotent, God could prevent all evil. If God is all-loving, God would want to prevent all evil. But there is still evil in the world. This is the central examination, the central question that drives theodicy. And theodicy sounds like an incredibly, way up there ivory tower word, but it deals with very central concepts to our lives. We encounter theodicy every day. And that central question is where the challenge comes in. When we get into suffering situations, what we want are real answers, certainty, pure explanation that can make everything okay. What we don't want is bromides, and that unfortunately is what we often get in those awkward and painful situations. One of the things that often infuriates me as a pastor is the idea that I get from many people in my role when there's a difficult situation and they believe in their heart of hearts that I can say something to make it all better. Often they believe and they want me to say something to cut through the uncertainty, the pain, and they believe that as the pastor, I should have that magical and divine ability. But often what happens is the best ministry that I can provide is counterintuitive. It's not to say anything. It's just to provide a presence. It's just to provide the ability for you to say all of the anger and the confusion and the pain that you're going through, to just throw it at me, and for me not to judge you, to be God in that situation, to be in that moment with you, not up here telling you nice things, but with you in the situation. That often is the best thing that I can do, even though at the time you're all probably wondering, say something. I once had a youth in my youth group in my first appointment commit suicide. And I remember being in the room with a bunch of teenagers, and there was another woman there. She was a friend of the family, and we were just listening to that. We were just letting, I was letting the kids just talk. Just let's begin to get this all out. Let's just provide a non-anxious presence. And the other lady was, I think she was Pentecostal or something, and she was giving a bunch of the bromides, and she was just starting to preach. And finally, she just turns to me and says, "Well, preacher, don't you have something to say?" And I told her, I said, "No, there is nothing to say. This, I didn't use this exact word, but this stinks. And there's nothing else you can say about it. God knows that it stinks. And God is here with us, crying with us, hurting with us. But no, there's nothing I can say. And I'm not going to. That would be pastoral malpractice, to just give you a bromide when what you really need is a shoulder to cry on. And suffering is especially painful when it happens to the innocent, like children. We have, this idea in our world, like I said, that children should be innocent and blissful and happy and ignorant of the pain and the sin of our world. And so when suffering happens to children like those children in the cemetery in Pine Hill, our heart breaks because we see that injustice and we see the pain that's brought upon by the randomness of suffering. We think of the families who had their hopes dashed for the future brutally by the painful reality of death. But in suffering, we know that there are more things than just suffering. The suffering that is caused by mental illness, diseases like ALS, which just took Sandy Thurgoland's life, is a reminder that suffering is far more than just dying. Suffering can almost seem preordained because there are things like hurricanes, forest fires, and just random events that cause us immeasurable suffering out of purely natural consequences. We're just sitting minding our own business and a hurricane hits us and we live in New Orleans. And there are many different ways to deal with this question, this theodical question of suffering. The strategy that you're probably more familiar with is represented by what's called the theistic tradition of Christianity. This has become so embedded in our modern thought that we often take it for granted. And this tradition goes way back. It has two primary fathers, St. Augustine and John Calvin, who decided to formulate a theology of suffering around God's sovereignty and God's omnipotence. This is natural. They faced what we all face. Where is God? What is God up to in the face of suffering and evil? Where is God when bad things happen? This point of view leads many to see suffering and evil as not real, completely subjective, and based on a finite mortal perspective and not based on God's eternal plan. This is a view of every event, whether suffering-inducing or not, is baked into the words of the Westminster Confession of Faith. And this is, if you're Presbyterian or grew up Presbyterian or were confirmed Presbyterian, this was part of the Westminster Confession of Faith that you would have said at your confirmation. Because it comes from John Calvin, who kind of formulated this Presbyterian theology and theodicy. It says, God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatever comes to pass. Sounds a little brutal, doesn't it? Taking the logic of this statement, this means that God ordained the most horrible experiences in your life, looked approvingly as you experienced horrible tragedy, injury, or sickness. Is there any wonder that so many people fall from the faith at the hands of a theodicy that goes on this route? Now, pointing out, this is still a Christian theodicy. This is not a heresy. This was never labeled as such. This is a way of looking at it. So I am not, condemning this. I am merely suggesting a better way for those who need it. So, although many Christians are horrified when they see the concept of God's omnipotence spelled out with such clarity and remorseless logic, they have nonetheless, and many of us have, internalized this doctrine at the core of our piety. We say things like, why did God kill my baby? Why did God take my baby or my father or my uncle? Why did God permit my baby to die? All of these things presume that God willed and is the ultimate cause of this death or suffering. And attempting to soften the bite of that claim, they will say things like, and we will say things like, nothing happens that is not of the will of God, or everything that happens is part of God's plan for my life. To this point of view, there are no accidents, no chances in life, no good luck or bad luck. All events, even the most minute little details, such as your shoestring coming untied, are God's doing. And many Christians have compelling reasons to advocate and to believe in this theodicy. And there are parts of it that are indeed wonderful. Many times you'll hear things like, but without the suffering, I wouldn't be the person I am today. And that certainly can be true. Or something else like, but there were all of these good things that came out of that suffering. And these things can certainly be true about suffering. There's also the saying that is often used by us at the precise wrong time, and I can't count on my two hands how many times, is God is in control. Really? Now, that's certainly true in the ultimate sense. But think about it from the point of view of the person you may say it to. Really? My child just died. My marriage just broke apart. My mother just died of ALS. And God's in control? Terrorists are taking over countries. Our own country is conflicted and polarized. Mass shooting after mass shooting. And God is in control? Maybe we need to look at new management. I mean, come on. Yes, like I said, in the ultimate sense, God's got this. He's already won the victory and He's working it. But this is from my own heart to yours, not technically a part of this sermon. Please don't say that to someone who has just experienced a tragedy. When it seems like if God was in control, He just kicked me in the you-know-what. Say that when you were with a friend and you're talking about, hey, this happened and the good came through it, and isn't it great that God brought me through it? That's a good time to say God is in control. But when you have someone who is going through pain and heartache or just brutality, that is often not the best time to say that. But let me absolve you from the guilt you may be feeling to work on it next time. We don't know what to say. And so that's why we say things like that. And later on we go, gosh, that was not the right thing to say. So that's why the best thing is just to be a presence. Just to be there, to let them cry and let them just vent. Let them just get all of the frustration and confusion out. So back to this theodicy question. Many Christians adopt this theodicy because they see it as the only guarantee against the threat to meaning in their lives, right? For millions of Christians, to believe that God caused or willed or permitted the death of their child or the genocides of the 20th century or the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers is their only assurance that a child's death or genocides or the collapse of the towers is not ultimately meaningless. And so that is an honorable perspective to have. Classical theism, the point of view we probably hear more than any other, deals with evil, though, by basically denying its existence. This really wasn't evil because it's all part of God's plan. Denial is a very natural coping mechanism for people. And it's important to note that this theodicy, like I said, is still Christian. Someone who believes this is still a Christian because they still believe in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. This theodicy is one way to look at the problem of suffering and evil. And in the heat of the moment, when someone is going through that suffering, it is not the right time to correct them. But it also can do great harm. This theodicy can. It gets God's nature skewed, and it gives in to our own greatest temptations. There are other ways to think about suffering, other Christian ways to think about suffering, ways which I believe match much closer with the truth of the Bible and the truth of the nature of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ. So let me start with a question, which you can answer rhetorically in your own heads. What is the highest form of power? Think about that. What is the highest form of power? Is omnipotence the highest form of power? It's certainly what we assume, right? If God walked into a room full of X-Men and Avengers, they would all go, okay, dude, you can have this, right? You have superpowers like way beyond what we can even imagine. You handle this. God is the ultimate superhero. And God is God, right? Because of all the omnis. Omniscience, omnipresence, He's omnibenevolent, all-loving, all those omni things that make up God that we talk about. And right from the beginning, though, we see God showing us His nature. But it's much different of a show than all the omnis may lead you to think. You heard the scripture this morning, right? How God created humanity, and what did He do? He gave power away. It would be well within God's realm of control to say, all right, humans, you just enjoy it. I got this. But He didn't say that, did He? He said, humanity, male and female, I've created you in my image. Go, fill the earth and master it. Have dominion over the plants of the land and the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, the animals. Take care of them for me. Does that sound like a God who holds on to His power, to His omnipotence? He gave us power right from the very beginning. This tells us a lot about the nature of God. Then there's this funny thing Paul says in 2 Corinthians 12:9. This is Paul talking. He said to me, my grace is enough for you, because power is made perfect in weakness. And he continues, so I'll gladly spend my time bragging about my weaknesses so that Christ's power can rest on me. And then in describing Jesus' ministry and describing Jesus' life, Paul also writes in Philippians in chapter 2, verses 7 through 8. Instead, he describes God emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Does that sound like a God who deals with the world through omnipotence? Does that sound like a God who goes, boom, you over there, boom, you over there? Does that sound like this kind of a God? But that is often what we assume, right? We hear all the omnis in God's description, and we just think of this big, powerful King Kong-like thing that just makes everything happen and micromanages stuff. But when God actually came to us, when God showed us who He was on earth those 33 years, so that we would have no doubt about God and no doubt about who He was and how He dealt with evil, what did He do? He emptied Himself. Paul tells us He took the form of a slave. And when God was found in human form, He was humble and obedient. Does that sound like a micromanaging God who flaunts His power? After all, why in the world would God choose to come to us at Christmas? With all the power of a baby's newborn cry and a hint to the rest of the world. What if the greatest power to counteract evil lies not in omniscience, omnipresence, omnipotence, or omni-whatever, but in God coming to us in the form of a scandalous child of a newlywed working-class family making a forced march, and then right after that being forced to go to Egypt to escape Herod's wrath? And as we question theology and suffering and theodicy even more, let's not forget the Christmas story. While it was good news to the whole world, it was not good news to all those other mothers in Jerusalem. How did God work that out? Or in Bethlehem? All those other families who would have their children murdered by King Herod. That was all caused by the birth of Jesus. So where was God in all that? That's why theodicy is so important. Because strange and hard to interpret and think about questions occur like that on a day-to-day basis. There are many times when there are two good things which both have terrible bad consequences. But what if God's perfected power lies in weakness, laying down his fame and strength to suffer with us and die innocently? His only crime making the religious authorities mad with his lack of pretension, but yet searing critiques. Is God's power in the Good Shepherd of Psalm 23, who lays down his life for the sheep, or is it in the power to know everything there is to know? Is God's power in micromanaging the world or being a control freak? Or is God's power in coming alongside humanity in this crazy world that we live in? And furthermore, what if creation is still an ongoing process? The Bible never says that it ended. It says that God rested. What if creation is still an ongoing process? What if God is at work in the world, recreating it from the ground up, so that it is free of evil, sin, and suffering? This is not to say that we should believe in human progress, that, oh, we're in the 20th century, we shouldn't do this now. No, we're still sinful human beings. We still struggle with evil. But what if the suffering in the world is not the product of a God who's in control all the time from above, but a product of good, bad, sin, righteousness, and randomness all thrown into the mix together? And what if, within that mix of the good and the bad and the ugly in the world, God is still at work within us, nudging us, and nudging the whole world to Easter, all the while working with our free will to that new creation that is born from above? Isn't the power of Easter the power of new life in the face of sin and death? Isn't that what it's about? That's why Easter happens after Good Friday. Listen to the words of Ecclesiastes, chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. Again I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to the skillful, but time and chance happen to them all. This is words in the Bible. For no one can anticipate the time of disaster. Like fish taken in a cruel net, and like birds caught in a snare, so mortals are snared at a time of calamity, when it suddenly falls upon them. The writer of Ecclesiastes saw that sometimes things are just random. Sometimes there is no sense to make of tragedy. There is indeed a time for everything under the sun. Nothing is new. God has seen everything before. And so, thinking of suffering, we try to ascribe it to the will of God, as if God is micromanaging the situation from the outside. But, like I said, when God came to us himself, when he came to earth to show us who he was and how he worked, he did none of that. Instead, he came into this suffering world and brought new life. He brought hope. He brought healing to our suffering. Instead of from on high, he came with us and brought healing and hope. He did not fix all of our suffering right now with a magical stroke of his wand, but he showed us the way through our suffering. He showed us the way through our suffering to the new life he had in store for us. Many times ascribing suffering to the will of God is just too much of a stretch, and it alienates people from God instead of bringing them closer to him. Like I said before, sometimes suffering just happens because of the intersection of many different factors and crazy happenstances. When someone gets cancer, it's not because God is in control. It's because the cells in their body began dividing uncontrollably. When a loved one dies too early, like my father in a car accident, we often try to see the omnipotent God as the controller or the orchestrator of the event. But remember, he gave us choices. He gave us free will and dominion. And maybe the fault lies with a human actor and not a divine one. Maybe our loved one died like my father did when an exhausted, overworked, and sleepy driver in a utility truck ran off the road and accidentally killed him. It wasn't God's will any more than it was my father's or the person driving the vehicle. It was just tragedy. When someone gets ALS, Alzheimer's, lupus, or some other causeless disease, we try to ascribe it to the will of God. But maybe it just happens because our bodies, just like the world, are meeting with all the randomness and chaos of a world of original sin, human choices, systematic justice and injustice. And there are perfectly good scientific explanations as to why bodily pain, mental anguish, and social oppressions occur. And I believe that alongside that suffering, God is still the transforming God. The suffering God who meets Good Friday, who comes to it of his own accord, and meets it with the power of Easter every time. That's what he did when he walked among us. And because I'm a Christian, someone renewed and born again, I believe God continues to do it to this day. Methodist theologian John Cobb wrote a beautiful explanation of this idea, comparing it to the different forces of good and evil in work in Auschwitz. He says, "Let us take Auschwitz not simply as a paradigm for genuine evil, but also as a paradigm for the way the world as a whole and in general is. But when we look at the world with expectations established by Auschwitz, we will also find much to astonish us. There are many patterns of human relations in which people seem genuinely concerned for the good of others in community, no matter how bad things get. Must there not be something at work other than narrow and brutal self-interest? Can we not call that God?" So to wrap things up here, where is God when suffering occurs? Where is he? He's suffering with us, holding our hands when our spouse is no longer there to do it, loving us unconditionally when no one else does. When everyone else condemns us and tells us we're weird or not good enough, God tells us he loves us and accepts us for who we are and walks with us to lead us forward. God is resurrection working through us when we pack meals for the hungry and build relationships with strangers while we feed through our abundance. God is resurrection working through us when we are present at the hospital with a crying family who's just experienced the joy of new life, and also on the next floor of the hospital as another family cries in anguish as life ebbs away from a loved one. God is at work when a poor family loses child after child after child, like those graves in the cemetery. And instead of becoming callous and bitter, they adorn each tombstone with love and care because they trust that those children really are precious to God and that God grieves with them. The sovereign power of the triune God is not unilateral power. Sovereign power, the power that is ultimately more effective than unilateral power, is the power of the resurrection. There is no more omnipotent, sovereign, triumphant power than the power of the Creator God to bring new creation out of the open, out of the free and risky creation we have with us. We do not need omnipotent power to answer the deepest challenge to the meaning of our lives unless what we worship is not the God of the triune identity, but rather the God of absolute unilateral power, which according to the book of Revelation is the false god of Caesar rather than the ultimate power of the Lamb. Maybe that's why they chose the image of a lamb. The ground of our confidence is the promise God made evident and confirmed by the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. Resurrection power of God does not annihilate the past, but it transforms the past. Suffering is probably not the will of God, but always within our suffering, there is a will of God. And God is with us, nudging us toward that. God did not will my father's suffering. God did not will terrible things to us, but He has a will within the tragedy that occurs. He has a way through. The Trinitarian God, the God of the Bible, is not a Gentile Lord or a cosmic Caesar. God is the God of Jesus Christ, of that suffering servant, the God of the cross, the God of the resurrection, the God whose power is the power of love, and whose might is the power to transform death in its many and common forms into rebirth, whose might it is the power to transform the old creation into the new creation, the sin and suffering and death of the old heaven into a new heaven and a new earth. And one of those greatest images we do have. And think about just how radical of an idea this is the power of the Lord's Supper, right? Jesus could have eaten for the last time with His disciples and laid a spread out, right? He's God. He can just poof, make it appear. They could have had steak and lobster and foie gras or whatever. It could have had anything. But God picks the meal of slaves who God told to eat with their sandals strapped and their belts around their waist. Eat in a hurry. They didn't have time to cook good bread. They had to just lay some flour and water on a skillet and go. People joke about matzah and how terrible it is. Well, they didn't have time to cook good stuff. They were poor. They were slaves. They didn't have money to cook good stuff either. And God picks that kind of a meal. And when He does this, He doesn't promise that where He's going there will be 70 virgins and life will be wonderful and you'll have steak and lobster eventually, but No, He says, this is the meal of my suffering for you. This is the meal of me walking beside you in your poverty, beside you in your pain and your suffering. This is a meal of blood and body, not of esoteric happiness. This is a meal to meet us right where we are, because sometimes where we are stinks. This is a meal of real life that can lead us to heavenly happiness, but understands that where we are just might not be there right now.